Great stories change the world, and stories are great because they are about the truth. Today, I'm going to be going over comedy versus tragedy. There are only two types of stories, and I'm going to be going over both and their relation to expressing truth. But before we get into that, I want you to go into the description and click on that link for a free fantasy ebook. And remember to like, follow, subscribe, all that stuff so you can get more stuff from this great channel. All right? Peace. Welcome back to Great Stories Change the World. This is the YouTube channel where fantasy science fiction author, that's me, goes over different elements of great storytelling. I review movies and books and TV shows, and I give you tips on great writing and great stories because I want us to tell great stories because guess what? I believe that great stories change the world. And today, I'm going to be going over the only two types of stories that there are. Now, I know you're saying, what about comedy and fantasy and science fiction? Those are all genres. And there are books, there's one of my favorite books is The 7 Forms of Story. There are only 7 stories, and some people say there's 5, but I'm going to say there are only really 2 kind of stories that we tell. And they are within some of these genres and character arcs and those sort of things, because when you know the type of story that you're in, you can really hone in and make your story great and impactful to other people. There's that scene in Stranger Than Fiction with Will Ferrell where, he's talking with the professor and what kind of story are you in? Are you in a tragedy? Are you in a comedy? And this is related to that, but I'm going to be going over a more classical definition between comedy and tragedy, all right? And they both have to do with the truth. Now, first of all, a comedy. What is a comedy? A comedy is where people believe a lie, somebody, usually the main character or a group of people, but maybe not the main character, but somebody believes a lie. And as they go through the story, they must discover the truth, and they must come to the truth or a truth by the end of the story, and thereby they are transformed for the good. They are stronger, they have more stuff, whatever it is, there is a real valuable transformation that occurs within the character. Usually they become more of who they were supposed to be in the beginning or whatever when they come to know that truth, when they begin to live that truth, discover that truth, and act on that truth by the end of the story. Okay, so that's a comedy. I know we all think about comedy as they're funny and they're slapstick or it's a sitcom, right? Situational comedy. But a comedy in the classic Greek term definition is something with what we call a happy ending, but we got to know why it's a happy ending. The happy ending is when people believe a lie and then they come to know the truth. Now, this can happen in all sorts of different genres, right? This can happen in a science fiction or a fantasy or in a funny movie that we call comedies, right? So many situational comedies are based on people believing a lie or not knowing the truth about something. Something's hidden, and this guy is really homeless, but he's being looked at as this CEO of a great company, and that situation is funny because there's a lie. But by the end of the movie or show, they all have to realize that this guy who they thought was a CEO is actually homeless. And what truth does that show them, right? The truth that's going to show them is there's really no difference between the CEO and the homeless guy. It's just our perception. You see what I mean? So that's a comedy in general. And of course, you can happen in science fiction, whether it's the Terminator, the original Terminator, where Sarah Connor has to believe she's a chosen person for this future, this hope and future, and she's going to give birth to John Connor, and she's got to kind of come to that truth. And then by the end, she's got to fight the Terminator so she can become that person that she's supposed to be. Okay, so that's a comedy. Now, well, what's the difference between that and a tragedy, you might say? Well, a tragedy is when people believe the lie. There are a group of people who believe the lie, or a main character who believes a lie, and they are confronted with the truth, and they do not change according to a new truth that they learn. And they are not transformed. And then they get consequences based on believing this lie or holding on to this lie instead of transforming and becoming who they were supposed to be according to a new truth, right? Because a new revelation, if we live by it, will change how we live, right? It'll change what we do. It'll change our perception of ourselves and others and all these sorts of things. And so therefore, a tragedy is when that doesn't happen. And there are usually really bad consequences at the end of a tragedy because people held on to a lie or they believed a lie. And then something sad happens at the end due to people not believing the truth. But in both cases, we're dealing with lies and the truth. Okay, so that's what the way it is in both cases. All right, I'm going to give you some examples here of how this works. All right, so first of all, I'm going to go over the ultimate tragedy. Well, maybe not the ultimate tragedy, but I'm going to go over one of the most famous tragedies, Romeo and Juliet. Now, if you've never read Romeo and Juliet, hopefully you haven't read it, because Shakespeare wasn't meant to be read. Plays, screenplays really aren't meant to be read. They're meant to be watched and seen. And so, therefore, hopefully you've seen a version of Romeo and Juliet. There's been several over the years. Check it out if you never have, if you think, man, I've heard of Romeo and Juliet, but I don't really know. So the whole setup of Romeo and Juliet is there are two families who are having a feud with each other. Right? They don't like each other. They're two different families in this major city, and they're political rivals or cultural rivals, and they don't mix. They hate one another, and they fight one another, or more of a Cold War situation. But there's actual violence, right, that happens because of this in the movie, in the play Romeo and Juliet. And of course, Romeo is from one of the families and Juliet is from the other. And so these two families that aren't supposed to like each other, they're supposed to hate one another, they're supposed to want each other dead, right? No holds barred, sort of thing. Here, these two young people fall in love. And we can all relate to this, right? We can all relate to two teens being passionate and romantic and lustful to a certain degree, right? Just, passionate about one another and falling deeply in love. And that's a major part of the story. But of course, there's the complication of they have to keep it secret. And when people find out, what are they going to do? And so they again, there's lying, there's keeping things secret, and they have allies and they have enemies, and there's even a great big sword fight, and there are different people along the story that help push it forward until the very end. Spoiler alert, and I'm using this because I'm assuming everybody knows what happens at the end of Romeo and Juliet. At the end of Romeo and Juliet, he thinks she's dead, which is a lie, right? Because in order to fake her death, a priest or whoever gave her this potion that would make her look dead so they could try to get her to escape and get Romeo, and her back together, right? Well, he finds out that she's dead, and he goes to the grave, and she appears dead, and he's got this great big speech, right? And he kills himself based on believing a lie. He never got to the truth, right? And she wakes up after the drug wears off, sees that he's killed himself, and she kills herself because it's hopeless, and they can't be together, and yada, 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 right? So there's lying within that sort of scene and with the end. But the big lie that Romeo and Juliet deals with that doesn't get dealt with, and the people don't come to the truth, is that the Capulets and the Montagues, or whoever the two families are, they shouldn't hate one another. The truth is that they're not that different, that they're both people, that they should work together, that they should find a way to reconcile their differences, that the truth is that they shouldn't hate one another. Hate is a lie, right? And just because someone has a different name or is from a different family doesn't mean we should hate them. This is a huge truth, right? And we all relate to this and we can all believe in this. And there's a huge, we know this is the lie that they deal with in the tragedy of Romeo and Juliet, because at the end, the king or somebody, I forget, the prince, somebody comes in and has this huge speech at the end about the tragedy of the different sides not liking each other and hating one another. In fact, you could call it sort of a reconciliation to the truth at the end, because he's like, look, you guys need to work this out. And because of the death of these two young people that everyone loved on the each side of the family, right? Then therefore they had to come to that truth. But it took death. That's what makes it a tragedy. It took death in order for people to see the truth. And that's the beauty of a tragedy. If there's no truth that we can all kind of agree on, there's some sort of universal truth that we can express, then if that's not being shown in a tragedy, then it's not really a tragedy. Then if bad things are happening just because they're bad things and we want to watch bad things, that's kind of icky, right? That's kind of shady, and it's kind of, porn in a certain sense. Or we just want to watch people have bad things happen to them for the sake of bad things happen to them, and like we're enjoying that. That's sadistic, right? So that's why tragedy is really important, that it always comes back to a truth that it's expressing, and comedy comes back to a truth that it is expressing. All right, so let's deal with some characters from another huge property that I'm not going to give any spoilers for, because if you haven't seen Lord of the Rings, I'm sorry. I'm going to give some spoilers here, but we're going to look at some of these characters and the lies that they believed. All right, let's look at Frodo. Now you might think, well, what lie does Frodo believe that he has to come to the truth of at the end? Well, there's a couple here, which is, first of all, that he starts to take this adventure and he thinks he's going to be able to easily give it over. He thinks, okay, I'll take the ring and I got to get it out of the Shire and I can hand it over when I get to Rivendell and all that sort of stuff. Well, that's not true. He has to come to that realization. So that's kind of in the first book, right? And then as we get to the end, right, he survives, and the whole goal for Frodo was to save the Shire. That's what he wanted. He was getting rid of the ring because his real motivation underlying everything was that he wanted to save the Shire. And so he felt that if he survived, he'd get to go back to the Shire and live in the Shire. But guess what? That wasn't true. He had been so fundamentally changed and wounded by his adventure and his experience, he didn't fit back in the Shire. He couldn't live in the Shire. He had to move on to the Elven lands, right across the sea, right? So that's Frodo. Those are lies that he believed and truths that he had to come to along the way that transformed him and had him make other decisions. All right, you with me? Now, what about Aragorn? Aragorn he's the king, the Return of the King. He's a big hero, but in the beginning, you especially get this in the movie. They really hone into this in the movie. In the beginning, he feels like he's coming from a line of kings who have failed, and that's in his blood, and so he calls himself by Strider, and he's not going to take up the mantle of being king, which he could have at any point. Because of his bloodline, he could have gone to Gondor and become king at any time, but he had to go through certain things in the story to step up and be the person he was supposed to be, or who he really was, depending on how you want to kind of look at it. Because the truth always has to kind of go alongside identity when you're dealing with certain characters, right? Who are they really? Are they really a hero? Are they really a villain? Or what's their flaw? What's their strength? right? And as they deal with these lies and truths that they have to come to, that's the transformation. And so for Aragorn, right, he's Strider at the beginning, and then over time, you see him develop and take on, and they make it really clear in Return of the King when Elrond comes in and gives him the sword, gives him the old sword and remade the sword, right, that was broken, and sends him through the Death Canyon thing with all the, like, in order for this people to survive, in order for you to help other people, you're going to have to become the person you really are and take on that identity. So he had to live that truth. He had to go into the dead places, right, and get the dead army and all the whole thing. What about Legolas and Gimli? I could keep going on with this. What about Legolas and Gimli? They both believe, kind of like in Romeo and Juliet, that dwarves and elves should hate each other, right? They have all this history. They have all this stuff in their background. And so they hate each other, and they're always at odds. And yet at the end, especially in the book, but by the end, they are friends. And at the end, they're almost brothers and family. And when you read into the Return of the King in the book, man, it's even closer. They hang out for decades or a century or some craziness, right? They just go and explore Middle Earth together. It's an amazing thing. But they had to come to that truth. They begin with a lie that causes conflict, and they had to go through things in the story to help them realize the truth. And this is what I'm talking about. So when you have the lie and the truth, this is very simple. But this simple thing can really drive your whole book, your whole movie. It drives everything. What lie do the characters believe, and what truth do they need to come to, and what events do we need to put our characters through in order to get them to realize the truth that's going to be good for them and good for everybody else? That's what makes a good story, and that's what makes us cry at the end of Return of the King, and that's what makes us just so frustrated at the end of Romeo and Juliet. If they would just see the truth, then they could have good things, right? They could be together. So that is the difference between a comedy and a tragedy. And I could go over different ones. You could go over Eowyn, who was the noblewoman of Rohan, right? She believed that she was doomed to live some sort of life of just like a housewife, sort of just a lady who was just kind of stuck away, but she wanted to go out and have adventure. And there's this beautiful story, this beautiful chapter within Return of the King where she and Faramir are both wounded and they fall in love. And he has to convince her that if she stays with him, he won't put her away in a castle somewhere where she never sees adventure. And this was like in the 60s, man. Like the fact that Tolkien is writing about this and empowering women, that it doesn't have to be like this. This is a truth, a universal thing that we all long for. So as we can see this, I really encourage everybody, if you're a writer, if you're a creator of some sort, when you start to put this stuff into your stories, it's going to make your whole story come alive. It's going to make your characters come alive. It's going to make us care about what happens to them. Even if it's a sad ending, a tragic ending, make it about a lie that needs to be addressed with the truth. And whether people accept it or not, villains, by the way, usually don't accept the truth, right? That's because they're the tragic characters a lot of times, right? So let me know what you think of this. Let me know what you think about my description about only two different stories, and if this helped you at all, put it in the comments. Let me know about some other characters where you can see some of this. I'd love to have those discussions in the comments. And remember, go into the description and click on that link for a free fantasy ebook so you can see some of my writing. It's just download it right to you. And remember to subscribe, and I'm going to have some more sort of writing tips and teachings here coming into the new year as we get into things. All right, so have a good day. Peace.